All right, I guess we'll start kicking it off. So, Adam, I'm gonna mute myself and turn off the camera. So, take it away.
Awesome. Well, welcome everyone to another contributors chat. So just to catch everyone up, the reason for these is just try to get more everyone else involved of what we're working on, what's coming out next, but really to get a lot of feedback from everyone of what you'd like to see with Ionic, some, I guess, new features you'd like to see, things like that. So we really want to get connected, more so with the community, make sure that we're, in the right direction, but really kind of show off what we're doing and get a lot of feedback. So this is our second one. We plan on doing more of these meetups. So please, if you can sign up for the meetup group, we'll be sending more of these out. Probably every other month we'll be doing these. And we're also going to be planning on doing, an every other month with Capacitor also. So with that said, Liam is going to take it from here and kind of explain what we'll be working on with desktop.
All right, cool. So as Adam mentioned, some of the focus of today's meeting is desktop, but I wanted to sort of back up and talk about some of the bigger goals that we're going for V6. So there's 4 on the screen. The first one, of course, is desktop support. So that includes new components and also improving interactions with existing components. So these are components that are already in the framework, but maybe don't work very well on desktop devices. Next up is accessibility, so things like keyboard navigation and improved screen reader integration, so things like VoiceOver and VDA and TalkBack, really improving the Ionic framework experience for folks who rely on these assistive technologies. The third one, and this is something we're still sort of trying to figure out the best way to do, but it's theming. We want to make sure that theming Ionic apps are very, very easy. So we're exploring easier ways to customize apps without really having to think about, all right, do I need to use a shadow part for this? Do I need to use a CSS variable? Can I set this property directly on the host? If you follow me on Twitter, I posted, I think about 2 weeks ago, a Tailwind demo app. So we were exploring Tailwind as a way of, maybe we can sort of take some inspiration from Tailwind and integrate that to the framework. So we're still very much investigating that, a lot of research, but we're definitely interested in making theming easier. And then finally is more general developer satisfaction. We want to make sure that it's still fun to build with Ionic framework, make sure that there's not too many roadblocks. I'm sure there's some rough edges with the framework, but we're really looking to sort of polish that up, make APIs that are hard to use easier to use, and overall just make sure that it's still, like I said, fun to use the framework. So those are the 4 big goals. There's of course some smaller, minor other things that we'll do, big bug fixes, things like that. But those are the big 4 things. With Ionic Framework v4, we really started with our web components overhaul. So we got this really nice foundation for building out the framework without having to do constant refactors. With v5, we did a really big design overhaul, brought everything up to what iOS and Material Design are doing today. And now with v6, we have a really great opportunity to make some really, really great improvements in the framework that aren't just overhauling the foundation of the framework or making sure that it works, just really making sure that it's a really great framework. So I guess we can sort of get into the desktop talk if you want to go to the next slide. Please.
It's not updated for you?
Yep, there we go.
Yep.
Took a little bit. Okay. So I wanted this to be more of like an open discussion about desktop apps. So we're interested in looking to fill in the gaps with desktop support in Ionic Framework. So there's a few questions on the screen. We're going to sort of take it one by one. And our role, the Ionic team's role here is really just to listen to you all. You are the ones that are building with Ionic day to day. So we're interested in hearing from you. So I'll read off one of the questions, sort of clarify what that means. Then if anyone has anything to say, feel free to just chime in. So first one is, we're really interested in learning about what are the pain points in building for desktop specifically with Ionic Framework. So this could be things like, what are the components that are missing? What are components that don't translate well for desktop? So things like date time, date time works pretty well on mobile, but not so much on desktop. So what are things that need to be improved and what are things that are missing? So if anyone has any thoughts on that, you have the floor.
Yeah, especially the date picker for the desktop. It's working fine on mobile, but on the desktop it's still very difficult.
Yeah, and I think that's fair. That's probably the number one complaint or feature that's brought up to us about date time. Again, Ionic's always been mobile focused first, so that was kind of the first goal with this. But absolutely, without question, that would be on our list of to-dos for Ionic V6 is to really improve the date time side of things.
That would be nice. Thanks.
So anything else? Does anyone else have any like complaints or just like feedback of like what are kind of the missing things that Ionic has? Like if you are building a desktop app, like where are the I guess rough edges?
In the chat, some people are saying Ion Select, so styling is sort of out of place in a desktop environment. Another one says layouts, I think, and then desktop resolutions. What does desktop resolutions mean? Do you mean like media queries? I guess that's directed at whoever put that in the chat.
Yeah, I would guess that my guess would be the media queries where high resolution monitors and layouts. So right, like so with our lists and an item, right now they fill the whole 100% width of the app, which is great on a phone, but when you have a 2000 pixel monitor or 2000 pixel wide, yeah, it definitely doesn't translate well. And so I certainly would, that's part of the layout features that we're looking into. On that note, Liam, you did do a lot of research into CSS Grid and kind of doing some layout stuff. You want to kind of go over some of your feedback of what you've learned so far?
Oh yeah, yep. So one thing we had discussed early on when we were planning what we wanted to do for V6, we have this Ion Grid component that uses Flexbox, and one of the things we said is, hey, can we use CSS Grid for this? So we did some research. I wish I had pulled up my notes for this, but I'll try to remember as best I can. But the gist that we figured out was, Flexbox and Grid has some overlapping use cases, but really they're two separate use cases at the end of the day. There's some things that are really easy to do with Flexbox that are just really hard to do with Grid and vice versa. And also there's things that you can do with Flexbox or Grid, and it's really just a matter of preference. So I think one thing you'll see moving forward with, at least with our docs, is more guidance on how and when to use Flexbox, Ion Grid, and how and when to use CSS Grid. So, the trade-offs to make, the different use cases where you might want to consider Flexbox versus Grid, things like that. So I don't think we'll be getting rid of Ion Grid anytime soon, but I've definitely seen more and more people start to use CSS Grid since it just seems to work better for a lot of the use cases. The other thing I've seen is people using both Ion Grid and CSS Grid when they really don't even need the grid. So some of the other docs we'll be having basically just helps you determine whether or not you even need a grid system. Grid systems can get very complex, and so I think if you incorrectly add a grid system to your app, it just makes things a lot messier. So more docs about Flexbox versus CSS Grid, and then more docs about, when do I not even need a grid system?
Yeah, I'd say one thing that's been challenging is trying to get the top level feel to feel more like a desktop app. I mean, I'm thinking less about Electron PWA stuff, but more just a web application. So if you look at, even Ionic's own sites, your websites, right? You've got normal kind of nav bar menuing, things beyond just a sidebar menu, which you guys have right now. And, especially I think kind of the nav system, everything ends up looking like a mobile app that's trying to run on a bigger screen as opposed to looking like a web application, which I think is beyond just the grid CSS and gets into the, again, kind of nav bar and stuff like that. I know you guys are doing some stuff with breadcrumb being one kind of minor underpinning of that, but anyway, that would be very useful to work more like a normal web application.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. You know, like again, you know, Ionic is always mobile focused, and you know where we were different from Twitter Bootstrap and you know Material Design, things like that, was that you know we had tabs that worked like how mobile tabs work, but then tabs on the bottom really doesn't translate well at all on desktop. So we really need to provide, I guess, a better structure change for when desktop kicks in. And I think that's probably the biggest one, is like how, you know, side menus and tabs are really kind of completely different concepts between the two.
Looking in the chat, two things I see are a pagination component and then a table component. I wanted to talk about the table component. So we actually, we've talked about this in the context of like a data grid. So sort of like an Excel spreadsheet type of deal. You can have a complete library that is just focused on a data grid, a table component. So I think for V6, we probably won't do a table or a data grid, just because there's a lot of functionality, a lot of framework specific functionality. If you look at, I think it's AG Grid, they're a company who just sells an Angular grid component. So I think we'll probably seek to have like official community packages for data grids, but I don't think we'll probably, I don't really see us adding an actual data grid component into the framework. But paginator is pretty cool, and I didn't even think about pagination.
Yeah, I would just can add to that. A few weeks ago, I would have said, please add tables, but I've been coding a lot in that area the last weeks, and I just went back to using plain old table tags, also combined with functional components in Stencil, which made it quite flexible, and I'm very satisfied in the end. Of course, stuff like pagination, sorting, and so on has to be implemented, but also that's sometimes part of your data source actually, instead of the table component itself. So I totally agree, the table being a very special case and a very big one. But what I wanted to mention when talking about desktop is something we discussed in Stencil for a few months, as well as the forms library. I think you'll have much more complex and big forms usually on desktop compared to the web. So I wonder if the Stencil Forms project by Adam would fit into this world.
I knew you were going to bring that up.
Sorry, Adam.
Yeah, no, I think it should, for sure. The problem with in Ionic space is that, you know, it works in, you know, I guess in all frameworks. So really, like the forms, each framework has like kind of a, you know, a best practice forms library. You know, Angular comes with its own, but React certainly has a handful of top form libraries, things like that. Stencil really doesn't have one at all. So I think, so you know, the one that I've built in the past and worked on, that probably would be the official Stencil one. So yeah, that like we would be able to provide that one too.
Cool.
But yeah, that's a good point. Basically, desktop's going to have a lot, you know, bigger forms, things like that, and I would agree with that. So we need to make sure that that works. And I know Liam has done a lot of work recently with making sure like the form participation API is working well for us, specifically because we use Shadow DOM quite heavily. So to make sure that forms work well is a big part of, you know, what we have to do internally, things like that. But so far, so good.
Cool.
Cool. So should we go on to the next one, Liam?
Yeah, sure. Also, I'm looking in the chat. Breadcrumbs and expansion panel, someone mentioned. We are adding both.
Oh,
and then Popover. If you could just add in the chat what you mean by improved Popover, that would be super helpful. But yeah, breadcrumbs and expansion accordion panels, those are definitely getting added.
With the Popover, I just meant that, yeah, you know, sometimes you have like a button and you need to display a popover which is attached to the button. So you got that option to display a popover in mode iOS. So you have the small triangle. And yeah, it doesn't fit perfectly the design of a desktop app. And also like the popover is always opening direction bottom or not top or right or left, or, you know, so.
Sure. So
So
just
that more like positioning the popover, more flexibility.
Yeah,
with that.
positioning and a bit the style, I would say.
yeah, we got a lot more
But
space.
generally
in desktop.
speaking, if I can add some things, like I notice when I work with in teams in corporate, mostly when they gonna develop a new app, they either go for their design system built in house, or if they use Angular, they're gonna go for material. So basically, like all the missing component as the component which are in Angular material. You know what I mean? So
Yeah, yep, that makes sense.
then you got like the whole list of components which are used like by corporate. So yeah.
I see. Okay. Yeah, I think at least for the popover, there's definitely a lot of stuff we can do to increase the flexibility. The positioning one is actually something I've run into a few times, so I'd love to see that happening. But okay, cool. So let's go to the next question is just how are you building desktop apps? So are you using Electron? Are you making it a PWA? This is, I think, a little bit more capacitor focused, but we're interested in, for folks building desktop apps right now, how are you getting it out there?
I've tried building with Electron before, but there's something lacking there. That's how I feel when building Ionic with Electron previously. So that's my experience with that. So I tried to use. I usually built it with PWA. So that's my approach to that.
Can you elaborate on that a bit, Razman, and also Daniel, if you don't mind chiming in about, you said that you feel like performance degrades in Electron. Can you elaborate a bit on how it degrades or what the experience is?
So yeah, when you build with Ionic Serve, for example, when just to try it out, there's no problem, no issues with running of the apps and all that. But when you use Electron, it's like Cordova in the old days, So there was a slight. You need to. It will come out the console will come out. There was some issues on when I was trying to build it with Electron before. So that's what I'm very interested in. What Ionic is planning to do with that. So whether are you going to come up with something like capacitor as well, for in place for with Electron, or what's the approach there? So that was I stopped building Electron apps for a while now, so I forgot what was the issue that I had back then. But I remember that the performance was an issue for me, so I stopped building Electron apps.
Daniel, do you have anything to add based on your comment in the chat?
Yeah, I used Electron to create a desktop app, and then I tried to use in a company, they got a problem. So I felt that it was so slow than a PWA used to work. So I don't know. I feel that using Electron is so slow. But I prefer using PWA. But many people doesn't know how to use it, and it's a problem too. So something complicated.
Curious if anyone else has had a similar experience around performance with Electron, and could go maybe even shed more light or provide more detail about why or kind of how the performance manifested the issues.
I mean, a big part is just the install. It's a huge install if you're trying to do something. So you really need to have some very specific need to access desktop features that aren't available in a PWA to warrant doing it. But it kind of feels like, I don't know, if you're just trying to do an app that runs on the web or on a mobile device, a lot of times Electron's overkill in terms of install and updates.
Yeah, that's interesting. I kind of feel, I've got some experience with Electron too, and I have felt kind of the same way. You're shipping all of Node and all of Chrome and a certain version of Chrome. That's what at a minimum 120 megabytes just for an executable of a 50 kilobyte or 500 kilobyte app. So it is, I would agree with that. So a little bit, I guess we're talking about desktops and Ionic. So one thing we are interested in is like if Capacitor can play a much bigger role in this. And if Capacitor only did file system API, the only thing that we provided for desktop, I do feel, I have this hunch that that would cover 95% of the use cases of why someone would want to use Electron to begin with. So that's interesting. I mean, and so far it's a lot of the feedback we've received so far, but certainly nothing's being worked on. We haven't started this, but it's just a topic for discussion right now. So that's interesting.
Yeah, Capacitor in place of Electron, that would be awesome. That would be great.
Cool, yeah. Are you a user of Capacitor today, Rosman?
Yes, I use Capacitor since you guys made it a while ago. I think version 1. Now it's the latest one. Yeah, it's been great so far. So if it can be in place of instead of Electron using Capacitor, that would be a great way to move forward, I guess. Yeah, in developing desktop apps.
Cool. Would you see it as you're developing one app? You're using the exact same code base, and the goal would be to have just like different outputs of like you have like one build for iOS, one Android, and Windows and Mac. But you're still building one app, or would you have two different projects of a desktop project and a mobile project, and you'd be using Capacitor for both those?
One for everything, that would be great. Just one code base, and then just come up with all the Android apps, iOS apps, as well as the desktop app. That would be awesome. One code base for all of that.
Yeah, and that certainly speaks to making sure that Ionic has a better structure that lends for like a more desktop structure using the same app, and that's the big riddle right now of how to do that. Okay, cool. That's great feedback.
One thing I haven't heard anyone kind of mention, and this has been in back of my mind, is something like macOS Catalyst, at least for the Apple side of things, of being able to do both iOS, iPad, and like Mac desktop, and then considering that being one deployment target, and then having something like a Windows specific target for the more corporate world. Maybe even revisiting a Capacitor Windows platform that we had discussed before, instead of doing something more involved with Electron.
Yeah, for sure. I think that's, and I think it translates well, whereas, Electron's focused on desktop, Cordova was focused on mobile. There's really no reason Capacitor needs to be focused on mobile. The way that the internals work, the way that the bridge works, things like that, it's really just posting data to an operating system, and any operating system could be. So there's no reason why we couldn't also post to any one of them. And so that's really where this question comes from. With the bridge exists, it works well. It's version 3 is coming out in the next couple of weeks, and so like we're really confident in what Capacitor can do. Which brings up the question is like, why couldn't it do desktop? Because it's the API is there, the documentation is there, the plugins are already there, the plugin system works. So anyways, I'll quit ranting, but this is great feedback. Thank you. Cool. Anything else regarding PWAs and Electron?
No. Okay. I saw one thing in the chat. I just wanted to ask a clarifying question. So someone mentioned button groups were missing from the framework. Composable with drop down and date picker. My guess is this is like you click an Ion button and it presents a date picker. If that's not the correct assumption, please let me know. The other thing is I've seen form validation brought up a couple times. What are people looking in terms of form validation? Are you looking for like a form package built into Ionic? Are you looking for us to integrate with framework specific solutions? I know we integrate with the Angular forms package, but for React and Vue, I don't think there's really any integration at the moment.
Yeah, the button group stuff was meant as you described it. I recently did a small dashboard, and I just took this kind of one huge toolbar thingy at the top where we had quick selections for the month and the past month, but also a drop down with a few other settings and some date pickers in it. So it was like usually one component, but inside there were a few different ones combined together. So that was kind of nice. And I think we took the shoelace button group together with that duet date picker that's circling around in the stencil chat. So yeah, that was kind of nice. And regarding the forms, I mentioned it because I liked how Adam built his forms package, where you were totally free in how you present, for example, validations and how you get attributes on participating components. So it's all very composable and flexible and pluggable. For example, I plugged that library called Yup or Yup, how do you spell it? And it worked like a charm. So I think there are enough validation libraries already out there on the market, no need to come up with a new one, but it should be pluggable to all of those.
I think also another big thing missing on the form side is the visual design. So if you look at a typical, Ionic form, it's using Ion item and very kind of iOS settings driven style with rows. But if you look at a typical, Bootstrap form or, any of those other libraries on the desktop, it's a very, very different way that it looks to the end user. And it's not that easy to take the Ionic stuff and do it that way. So we've actually ended up doing our own stencil-based kind of forms thing just because, we wanted to have that control and have it look different on the two platforms. I think the validation is not too hard to squeeze in there. I think the stuff, Adam, you did on the forms library is more of a kind of a rendering lower level thing, but doesn't really get to the visual design that seems to be more in Ionic space. But definitely feels like a lot of people are struggling, or if people are building forms in Ionic right now, are facing something where it's fairly rigid in terms of its visual appearance.
Yeah, I agree. And so basically we need to provide, Ionic needs to provide better utilities of how if an error pops in, that it presents well, it fits inside the form well. Is that what you mean?
Well, even things like borders around enterable fields, right? I mean, there's whatever. There's the more typical, you could say material design versus iOS, but it's the label on the left with a fixed space for the field and the potential for multiple columns of fields and the typical layout. Again, if you just looking at, say, the Bootstrap examples as one of their forms, it's a very, very different visual appearance, and it feels much more like the typical desktop environment, again, versus more of the Ion item driven style. And so, you could have something that was much in the same way you guys are doing the material design versus iOS. Could be something where forms look different. Another thing, that's typical is you often have the buttons at the bottom as normal buttons versus a header style back style that that you get with the the current modals, and you can kind of do all that in stencil or in whatever, but it again, it's I think getting a visual appearance that feels more desktop like would be quite useful. Another just kind of question related to forms, and Adam, you'd mentioned the kind of kind of rendering oriented stuff being harder to go cross platform. I know this is a challenge for you guys, but we've wrestled with, a lot of times it's really nice to do functional components, do a lot of the rendering, but I imagine that's harder for Ionic to do given the platforms you support. But is there some guidance you have in terms of the way to utilize functional components as part of an architecture versus just web components? Because I think they are much better in some situations.
Yeah, I totally agree. We've done plenty of projects and stuff like that, and I normally end up writing functional components. I think they're a lot more reusable in that sense. When styles get involved, it's a little bit more difficult of how do you scope the styles and things like that. And where it really becomes a challenge for Ionic is we need that styling system, whatever it is, needs to work in all of the frameworks. And so that's really, that is the challenge, I think, of multiple building a UI library that works in multiple frameworks is just the styling. Because HTML is easy to crank out. And so that's why we ultimately went with Shadow DOM and Scope CSS of Stencil and things like that, because that is the lowest common denominator that works in all of the frameworks. So there's this big trade-off of, yes, we work in all the frameworks, but then it also makes it a little bit harder to style in each of the different variations of the frameworks. And so that's another thing that I think we'll probably never be done with in trying to improve. I know Liam and I have gone back and forth for a while now of how we can improve Ionic yet, and really kind of learn some lessons from, like you mentioned, Tailwind CSS and what they do right. But again, like if we go all in on a certain system, that system needs to work everywhere. And so it comes down to kind of building better wrappers and things like that so that they fit into the framework better. So I don't know if that answers your question, but I mean, as far as web component versus functional components, I totally see the value there of using functional components more. It's when you get into how you scope that style for that functional component is the challenge, I think. Cool. All right, should we move on to the what your deployment environment is?
Yep. So this final question, we're interested in hearing about how you were getting your application out there. So is it a public facing application? Is it internal for employees only? Are you deploying to Windows, Mac, Linux, some combination of the three, things like that?
Yeah,
Not all at once.
I mean, I've recently done intranet deployment running on Express powered server, which also hosts the front end, and it's totally isolated from the internet. So yeah, but it worked well. It's PWA in the front end, built solely by Stencil, and it just runs. I also have a few apps on the App Store, so that is, I think, what you mean with public facing.
Yeah, well, I think it's, as we're looking into desktop more and, there's things like Electron, PWA, if Capacitor goes into desktop, I'm curious, or we're all curious, like, if you're using Electron, like, why did you choose Electron? Is it because it's going to be just installed on a global intranet that is not meant to be public facing? It's never going to be installed by someone else. Or did you choose PWAs because you plan on having it to be basically a web page that anyone can get to? So it's really just kind of an open-ended question of just like, well, what's the reason for doing a desktop build in your practical sense? Like, why did you do a desktop build?
Okay, so maybe I will join discussion. Hello, everybody. We have a big app for public facing for many people. We do the live broadcasting of sport events. It's equestrian events, and we have a mobile application on the App Store, on the Google Play. With the same code base, we have a PWA application and a desktop application based on Electron. And it all works very well. It's Ionic 5 as a code. And we don't have any performance problem with Electron. I think not many people use it because we used Electron specially to publish our app in the Microsoft Store, which was the one way to do it a few months ago. Today we can publish a PWA app in the App Store, so the future version will be PWA. But for now, Electron is the only way to publish app, for example, for Mac OS or Linux systems, I guess, if you don't want to use a PWA application. That's why we choose it, because part of our application is using some technical equipment. We are using some serial connections with some elements for do the timing in the events. That's why we decided to use the Electron version of our application. But PWA, I think it's the future, and it's the best part of this everything. That's why we use all these elements.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Because that is also the big thing heavy on our minds is it pointless for us to make capacitor desktop when PWA is really, I kind of feel like are the future. Right now, only Chrome is able to write to the file system. I mean, that's a very brand spanking new API that just came out. So it's not really widely adopted yet, but if everything continues to move in that direction, is it just PWAs are the answer and be using that, especially with Microsoft Store going that direction. But then there's Apple. What are they going to do with PWA? So that's the big question. So cool. Yeah, that's good feedback. Anyone have anything else to add?
Well, if nobody's speaking, we had some problems with the desktop version of our app because Ionic is focused on mobile. That's why we had to do many components and elements in the desktop version. For example, date picker, tooltips, drop-down menus, etc. And it worked very well. We used in many of these components, we used Ionic Popover component as a base, for example, for tooltip, for our version of select component. And it wasn't very hard. I can show you if you want to share my screen to show you some examples how it looks like. But it's when we've prepared this desktop version of components, then our web page, which uses Ionic, starts to look okay for big screens. Without it, it was useless. So we had to prepare it.
Okay, interesting. So how do you choose between the difference of like when to show a desktop component, when to show a mobile component?
Well, I use the same solution as your split view component. Yes. So depending on the size of the screen, we choose what to show, media queries, etc.
Right. Cool. Okay, cool. All right, great. If anyone had anything else, we can probably move on to the next one.
Anything else in the previous question that you didn't get a chance to mention? Otherwise, yeah, we can just sort of go through some of the stuff we have planned for V6. No.
Yep.
Okay. So I wanted to go through briefly some of the things that we are currently working on. So these are all works in progress, but things like the accordion component. So we'll be adding accordion in V6. So I believe this is iOS versus material design. So it's the designs right here are mobile focused, but it's being built from a desktop perspective. So you'll have full keyboard support. You'll be able to tab to different accordions and expand or collapse using the space bar. I'll have full screen reader support. So voiceover, talkback, things like that will work great. So if you want to go to the next one, and then breadcrumbs. So again, being built from a desktop perspective so that it works great on desktop and then collapses down on a mobile device. So we have iOS, we're using sort of iOS/Mac OS to sort of differentiate between mobile and desktop. So breadcrumbs and accordion, I believe, are things that we have built. I don't think we've merged them in yet. They're still getting reviewed, but those two are built right now. And then the next one, I think, is something people will like a lot. So we're finally redoing Ion Datetime. We're completely overhauling it. So it's going to be a big project. It's going to take a little bit of time. So one of the challenges we're facing right now is there are so many different variants of datetime. Even just looking at what we have right here, there's on the far left, the material design calendar picker. And then when you go to the next one, the material design time picker looks totally different. And then if we jump over to iOS, you have this new calendar picker and then this redesigned time picker that's still kind of gesture focused. And then behind all that, there's still the sort of wheel picker thing that you have now in Ionic V5 that's still used in iOS. So one of the things that we're sort of trying to figure out how to account for is all these different variants of these layouts while still making the API easy to use, trying to minimize breaking changes, and also still trying to make the component as customizable as possible. So that's something we're definitely committed to doing for V6. And yeah, I think once we get a beta out, we're going to be looking forward to hearing feedback from the community.
Cool, yeah. And so the other update that's going on right now, so Ionicon's 5.4, and actually as of yesterday, 5.5 is out. It's got a 30 more icons by our very own in-house, the awesome Ben Sperry is put together. I think there's over 1,300 icons now available. So we're pretty proud of that package. The other thing that went out in Ionicon's 5.5 is that now there's also Ion Icon, the web component, is also exported as a traditional custom element that extends HTML element. And I can talk about that a little bit more. And this is really just another stencil build because Ionicons is also, the core of it's built with stencils. So therefore we can have different type of output targets of it. And so, 5.5 has the most recent core build of it. But the big news is that, there's many more icons available. And then the last thing I want to talk about is that we're going to be releasing in the next minor release of Ionic Core is that all of the Ion components are going to be exported, also another package exported as custom elements. Again, they're ones that extend HTML element, where if you're familiar with how Stencil works today, it'll lazy load components being used on demand. And that is not changing. That is always going to stay the same. So, update into the next version of Ionic, the minor version of Ionic is going to make no changes to how things work. What we are doing is providing one more package under Ionic/core/components, where again, all of the components you know and love are extending HTML element. Where this is useful is more of a traditional bundling package. So like our Ion View the package is going to eventually use these. Same with Ionic React and hopefully Ionic Angular, where those components will not have to lazy load themselves when you use them, because we're now relying on the bundler to do the correct thing. In the past with Ionic Angular in the version 3 era, it really was very difficult to lazy load the components that were being used. So no matter what we did, Ionic was always all 100 components were being pulled into the package, making the app much larger than it needed to be. And every single, there's 2 different or 3 different versions of the CSS. So you had iOS and Android and even Windows at that time. So it was very difficult to make a PWA with Ionic Angular at that time, which is why Stencil was created, was so that we could lazy load all these things. Fast forward to today, Webpack, Rollup, all of the tooling has gotten much, much better at being able to only pull in the components that are being used. And so Liam and I have actually put a lot of time into this to make sure that the components directory is only pulling in what's being used. And so we're certainly not making this the default yet because there's a lot of things to still work through. For example, there's never going to be polyfills for this version. This is going off the idea that this is for modern browsers, which surprisingly is basically all of them today. We don't have IE11 issues nearly as much as we did in the past. Even Edge is now Chrome for the most part. And so the future of this really we're not going to be providing polyfills or have it work with certain sort of custom element polyfills, things like that. And really it's just ideal for any projects that already have bundling. So if you have a React app that has nothing to do with Ionic, but you want to pull in just Ion button or Ion badge, that would work out great. And so that's kind of the direction we're going with this. And again, don't worry, this makes no changes to your current app. It's just a new thing, which is why it's going to be in a minor release. And it's just another Stencil output target. And if any Stencil users out there, it's under the disk custom elements output target. Any questions there?
When you're using this, Adam, this is really only for people who are using Ionic Core correctly, right? So like when the
Right.
next minor version ships, in terms of opting in to try it out, it's really only for people using the core components.
Right, exactly. So if you are building just a normal app without Ionic and you wanted to pull in a specific thing, you would use this for that. And also, you know, we've never really worked on IE11 to begin with, but this isn't set out to have the polyfills for that. But then it's also useful for us as the Ionic Core developers to have Ionic View and Ionic React depend on these, so that you may have noticed in your development that there is a 1 millisecond asynchronous tick that happens that React or Vue might render Ion item, but the web component hasn't lazy loaded yet and hasn't kicked in yet. For the most part, with the hydrated class being added, things like that, it's not too noticeable. But there are moments where you can get if you want to do get computed style, things like that, you're going to get a size of 0 if you do it too soon. That's why we have the component on ready. With this new system, we won't need component on ready. It's going to be it's basically, again, relying on the bundler to do the correct work, and it's allowing everything to be synchronous at the right times, if that makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, we've seen some pretty significant bundle size reductions, I think, with this custom elements build. So we're excited to get this out the door.
Yep. And so still would label as experimental throughout this phase under the, was it 5.6 is going out, Liam?
Yep, 5.6 is the next minor.
Cool. Yeah, so we'll be merging it in the master soon. And again, Stencil just released this Ionicon's released it yesterday with this build also. So cool. Any questions? All right, well, this good timing about wraps up everything we wanted to go over. I guess throw it out there for any other questions, any other topics you want to bring up. I think we can probably wrap it up.
Can I ask 2 questions quickly?
Sure, absolutely.
About the accordion, yeah, it looks really nice. It's only for list, or it's like a slot and you can add what you want in the accordion?
Yep, so it's a slot. You can put whatever you want in. It works best with Ion item inside of a list, but if you want to just do a regular old div for the header, you can do that as well.
Yeah, super. Yeah, because I want to delete my code and use standard code. And the second question is, yeah, it's not for desktop, but like a while ago, since you are speaking about components, you spoke, I think, about like a bottom sheet components for mobile. Is it still in the pipeline, or?
The bottom sheet?
Yeah, like one of the sheet you can drag from the bottom, like in Google Maps, when you drag something from the bottom and it comes up.
Yep, we'll have that for V6 too. We're still working on it. The interaction's a little tricky, so we're just ironing out the bugs. But yeah, we'll definitely have that.
Okay, cool. Oh, yeah, that's really nice too. I think that's gonna be a nice add-on.
Yeah. Oh yeah.
And then somewhat related, since we were also speaking about desktop and Capacitor, things like that, is that today Capacitor already does provide plugins for Action Sheet and Toast and dialogues, things like that. One thing I think we're gonna be working to call out more is that you could use Capacitor more to have these native interactions. Like when you're on Android, it's gonna use the real Android Toast, things like that. So I think right now you just gotta like find the plugin and realize that and install plugin and start using it. But I think in the future, we're gonna really be documenting more like the other options you have. And then at the same time that, let's say you use Capacitor Toast, in PWA land, it's gonna actually use Ionic Toast. And so that's, again, something that we're gonna be working on in the future to make it even easier to provide more native UI on top of everything. But then at the same time, using Ionic when it's a PWA. So there's really the exact same code you're using. You're able to have the same, I guess, predictable what's going to behavior between the two. They're going to look the same, things like that. So it's a kind of a next venture we'll be working on.
And you're going to integrate that in the documentation of Ionic components too, or something?
Really more in the documentation of Capacitor. Because right now, if you go to the plugins section of Capacitor, our website, you'll see we have a lot of these UI components, but we really don't explain like how you can use them. And something that I like to label as native UI is like you actually already have all these capabilities. You can use Action Sheet all the dialogues like alert, confirm, prompt, see toast. And I think there's another one that are available. And so we'll continue to go down that route. I think Fab would be another great, example of that. But what's cool is that there really is a one-for-one translation between Ionic and native. And so you can write, you can code this once. You don't even have to be using an Ionic app. It could be within a React app that's using something completely different, but still use Capacitor to call up the native alert. And if you're on web, that React app would call up the Ionic web component, which is also why Ionic core components exists is for that reason too. So it's just something that I think we're going to start calling out a little bit more.
Cool.
One question about the accordion. Will it preload all components placed inside of the body of each tab? Or would it be possible that they only get rendered once it gets opened?
The way it is right now, if I remember correctly, is all the components are in there, like each of the expanded contents, but it's when they're collapsed, they're hidden with display none. So they shouldn't impact the layout at all.
Okay.
Well, cool. I think we can probably wrap it up. I just wanted to thank everyone for attending. It was a great conversation. I was thrilled to have everyone attend. Please, tell people to sign up for our meetups. We plan on doing these probably every other month. But this is very, very useful, and can't thank everyone enough for attending and helping out. So thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much.
you. Thank you so
Cool.
much. Thanks.
Thanks, everyone.